Shalom and welcome to my weekly video message. Today I'd like to focus on the topic of priorities. I think this topic is one we can all relate to so much more today than we were able to 4 months ago. Of course, in the back of our mind, we may know what our priorities should be, but with the exhausting, fast pace of life, the deadlines and responsibilities that so many of us are faced with, it simply doesn't always seem feasible to make our priorities a priority. There's a well-known story of a philosophy professor that stood before his class with some items on the table in front of him. As the class began, he picked up a large empty jar and proceeded to fill it with large rocks. He then asked the students, "Is the jar full?" And they agreed it was. The professor then picked up a box of pebbles and poured them into the jar. He shook the jar lightly, and the pebbles, of course, rolled into the open areas between the rocks. He then asked the students again, "Is the jar full?" And they agreed it was. The professor then proceeded to pick up a box of sand and poured it into the jar. Of course, the sand filled up the remaining open areas of the jar. And then he asked once more, "Is the jar now full?" And the students responded yes. "Now," said the professor, "I want you to recognize that this jar represents your life. The rocks are the important things like family, that if everything else was lost and only they remained, your life would still be full. The pebbles are the other things that matter, like your job, your house, your car, and the sand is everything else, the small stuff." But then a student takes the jar and proceeds to pour a glass of vodka into it. Of course, the vodka filled the remaining spaces within the jar, making the jar truly full. The moral of the story is that no matter how full your life is, there is always room for a l'chaim. The Mishnah says, "Im lo achshav eimatai," if not now, then when? If I don't seize this very moment to fulfill its unique purpose, when will I be able to retrieve it? And so, there is no time better than now. And with our new realities, as much as they come with tremendous challenge and anxiety, I believe we now have new opportunities for pursuing deeper relationships and living an even more fulfilling life. In this week's Torah portion, we read that just before our ancestors entered the Promised Land, the tribes of Reuven and Gad made a special request to Moses. In a passionate plea, they explained that they had lots of cattle and that the fertile land east of the Jordan was perfect for their livestock. As such, they were requesting special permission that while the rest of the nation would settle on the west bank of the Jordan River, they should be able to remain on the east bank. "We will build pens for our livestock here and cities for our children," they insisted. "We will then arm ourselves quickly and go before the children of Israel until we have brought them to their place." Rashi observes that while Moses acquiesced, he subtly admonishes them in his response. "So build yourselves cities for your children and enclosures for your sheep." Moses changes the order of their words, hinting to them to remember their priorities. Children and our spiritual future come first. In contemporary terms, our livestock represents our physical pleasures and material wealth. Like the tribes of Reuven and Gad, at times we get carried away and focus more on our livestock than our family and spiritual pursuits. But how do we make sure that we prioritize properly? I remember as a young yeshiva student when we'd visit people on Fridays, and I would ask if they were willing to put on tefillin. Often they'd respond that they would do it, but at the moment they just don't have the time. And it would really puzzle me, not at the very moment they said it, but 10, 15, and sometimes 45 minutes later, as they were still chatting with me, I'd be thinking, "Didn't you tell me you don't have time?" And the truth is, in their minds, they didn't have time. It was simply because to them, tefillin wasn't a priority. It taught me that if I truly make something a priority, I will not only find time for it, but I will actually find that I will be managing my time better and find time for other things too. If we put the rocks in first, there will be room for the pebbles and sand. We need to spend time with our children. We need to make sure our spouse feels important. We need to find time to put on tefillin, light the Shabbos candles, give charity, and study Torah. And when we do, we will see that there is always time for everything else that needs to get done. While no one will argue that the last couple of months have been beyond challenging, for many it was an opportunity to connect with family and spirituality. But as we look forward and pray for an end to this pandemic and prepare ourselves to enter the promised land, let's never forget the powerful messages that we have learned about prioritizing and continue to make family, friends, and our spiritual pursuits our number one priority. Then we can be sure that everything else that life presents us, like the pebbles and sand, will fall into place. So what are your priorities? Shabbat Shalom.